My name is Ken Rosenberg. I see patients in our clinic in Marin in Novato and in Santa Rosa. I'm in Santa Rosa on Wednesdays and Fridays, and I'm in Marin on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I thought it could be helpful today for me to share some insights from the wisdom of how Chinese medicine sees the digestive system. I ask every patient about their digestion. In goes the good stuff. Well, hopefully you're taking in good stuff. And out goes the bad stuff. How this all operates and moves through the body provides diagnostic insights into patient care. Many patients find these talks interesting because the terminology and advice used in Chinese medicine can be different from what we are familiar with. I often find a simple piece of wisdom from this body of knowledge can be resonant for a patient and can reinforce what they've already observed in their own life, but have not fully appreciated or fully connected together until hearing the Chinese medical explanation. Okay, so why the digestive system now? Well, the digestive system is always important. But first, allow me to take you on a super quick journey into some of the history of Chinese medicine, and then we'll come back to now. You may have heard Chinese medicine goes back at least 3,000 years. Looking back through the history, there are many important books from each era. I'll limit this to a quick mention of only 3 for today. In each of these, there was a focus on what they believed at the time to be the cause of disease. While each of these bodies of work were snapshots from their time, they have all contributed to what is now a more comprehensive system of medicine based on 3,000 plus years of curated knowledge. One of the oldest texts, the Shanghan Lun, written in the year 220, proposed that most diseases were caused by excessive or prolonged exposure to cold. Cold weather and cold food are examples, and therefore these diseases were cold in nature. The author successfully treated many people and laid out concepts for the treatment of disease through various stages that are still utilized with great success today. What is interesting here, in the time of writing, an epidemic disease had taken the lives of nearly 2/3 of the author's family. His ideas were later replaced by another famous school of thought called the Wenbing theory of diseases, which put forward the notion that many diseases related to heat. These tend to be febrile in nature and can spread quickly, as epidemic diseases do. What's interesting is this was written as the Silk Road trade routes became active, and China had to account for the arrival of new diseases, such as smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis, typhoid, typhus, and others. And the last one I quickly want to mention was authored in the 1200s by a scholar and doctor named Li Dongyuan. His theory is known as the spleen-stomach school, also called the Earth School. In Chinese medicine, the spleen and the stomach are the heart of the digestive system, and their health is essential for the nourishment of all other systems and vital organs. In the 5-element theory of Chinese medicine, this relates to the earth element. This is the center of the body. Strengthening the spleen and stomach helps a person feel more centered and grounded. This body of work postulated that many disease processes began from disharmony in the digestive system. Li Dong's contemporaries were operating from previously mentioned concepts of disease caused by an external pathogenic factor, and their treatment strategy focused on expelling these pathogens. And while it was previously successful, these strategies were not addressing the current diseases that were prominent. Li Dongyuan instead realized people were sick because they were not taking care of themselves. His treatment strategy was to address lifestyle issues with his patients. His idea, and the current belief today, is that a lack of adequate self-care, overwork, exhaustion, and an overconsumption of excessive amounts of cold, raw, fatty, or unclean foods and excessive or unresolved emotional states were agitating the body and further weakening it. During this time, he was having success by fortifying people, while his counterparts who were still purging pathogens were not having much success. And so what I find so very interesting is when these ideas which came out of the spleen-stomach school came about during a time where China was going through great political unrest, which in my mind kind of brings us to now. Unprecedented times we're having. So Li Dong taught his patients their health problems could be repaired through the digestive system. Chinese medicine describes the stomach as the place where we meet the world and choose what we take in and what we refuse. The spleen is how we manage and metabolize what we take in. This not only refers to food and drink, but also to thoughts and ideas. Overthinking and worry deplete the spleen. For example, practitioners of Chinese medicine have always observed students who are constantly memorizing new information and regurgitating it at test time only to take in the next block of the curriculum, tire out their spleens through this activity. By the way, splenectomies are not uncommon these days, but those individuals still have a spleen meridian and spleen energy, so they're not off the hook. They're still vulnerable to this. Today, we are seeing this tired spleen syndrome and what we might call content fatigue. Too much news, too much social media, and so on. Even in the time of Li Dongyuan, nearly 800 years ago, there was the idea that socioeconomics could erode our health. Think how much faster news travels now and how many ways we are continuously bombarded by it. Over the past few months, I've had discussions with my colleagues, and we have all noticed more patients reporting higher levels of stress and anxiety and seeing a correlation with these emotional states and an increase in symptoms. So Li Dongyuan believed the cause of damage to the stomach and spleen occurred as a result of three main factors. One, a lack of moderation and restraint in eating and drinking, especially consumption of excess amounts of cold, raw, fatty, or unclean foods. Today, this would also include processed foods, artificial ingredients, food dyes, non-organic foods, overeating in general, and overconsumption of sweeteners. Without proper nutrition, opportunistic disease processes were able to overcome and overwhelm health, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Two, weak digestion on a physical level leads to exhaustion. On a mental level, when the organs of the spleen and stomach are distressed, the patient loses the ability to problem solve and to use their intellect. There becomes a tendency to over-ruminate on the same subject without the ability to act on a resolution, which leads to the third factor. As this situation creates a pathological state of unresolved emotions unable to be expressed and manifested. When these feelings have no outlet, they become trapped internally, which further exhausts resources, weakens the digestion, and causes further debility. So let me pause here just to make it clear. Yes, I was talking about organ function, and within the context of that, I was also discussing intellect. This is paramount to the understanding of Chinese medicine's view on organ physiology. In the West, consciousness and physiology are often separated apart, but in Chinese medicine, they are interconnected. To say mind and body, giving them two words is almost going too far. They exist on more of a continuum. It acts like a two-way street. Each one affects the other. Each organ has its own intellect and holds aspects of our emotions and consciousness. An imbalance or malfunction of an organ can solicit its corresponding emotional state. Or this can travel in the other direction. An emotion that persists too long or comes on too strongly can contribute to an imbalance in the associated organ. Back to the example I was sharing about the students constantly memorizing and injuring their spleens. Another example, planning and strategizing relates to the liver. I'm thinking of working parents now also coordinating homeschooling on top of busy schedules. Anger and frustration also fall into the domain of the liver. Put another way, thoughts, emotions, consciousness itself lives in the physiology of the organs rather than solely residing in the brain. You could say the brain is more of a movie screen than it is a movie projector. So when you're working your thoughts and emotions, you're working your organs. This is a key concept in being in right relationship with your digestive system. Stopping work to eat allows for optimal function of the digestive organs. Continuing to work at your desk, doing emails, reading the news, even watching TV, forces the energy of the digestive organs to compete for bandwidth. Some goes to processing information, and some goes to the physical aspects of digesting food. Furthermore, say you're watching the news while you're eating. Not so positive these days. You must also digest and metabolize those topics along with your food. The founder of the Institute for Health and Healing, Dr. Bill Stewart, has a quote that goes well with this topic. I added the word eat to this quote, which is, everything you think, say, feel, do, and eat is either health creating or health negating. Especially true while you're eating. How you eat, what you're doing while you eat, the pace at which you eat, the foods you choose, the variety of foods and the quality of foods, and even the temperature of foods can impact your health. And how you feel at the time, your thoughts are going to affect how well your digestive system functions. Modern nutrition tends to focus on quantitative metrics of food. Chinese dietary therapy came about long before these terms existed, perhaps 3,000 years before. There was no language of micro and macronutrients, vitamins and minerals, protein versus fat versus carbohydrate, and so on. Instead, they observed nature and attached qualitative measures to foods. By qualitative, we mean how does each food, hang on, just checking my screen here, making sure I'm still on. How does each food act on the body? Terminology to describe these phenomenon are up or down, in or out, and warming or cooling. Each food has been assigned an energetic temperature. Does the food have a warming or cooling effect on the body? The energy of the food has an affinity for specific tissues within the body. So foods are also assigned a location for the parts they affect. For example, carrots were assigned to the liver. When we look at this in modern terms, carrots are high in vitamin A, and vitamin A is stored in the liver. There are endless examples of this, and while it's interesting, my point is when we look at these ancient ideas through the lens of modern science, it's clear these guys were onto something. So temperature. These concepts predate refrigeration, so they're referring to what we call the energetic temperature of a food. But this does not mean we ignore the physical temperature. Both the physical and energetic temperature are important things to consider. The physical temperature is temporary. If you eat something physically cold from the refrigerator, energy is required from the body to warm it to body temperature. This energy comes from the digestive system. Once this occurs and digestion begins, what remains is the food's energetic temperature, its enduring nature. Warming foods tend to stimulate and support the digestive process, and cooling foods tend to work against this process. Looking around the world through the lens of these concepts, many popular dishes from traditional cultures are brilliantly balanced. Sushi is considered cold. Most raw foods are cold, and fish is neutral to cold. But sushi is traditionally served with ginger, and ginger is very warming and harmonizing to the spleen and stomach. Hot curries are often served alongside cooling yogurt to achieve balance. Some other examples. Green tea has a cooling effect, even if you serve the tea hot. You can try this on a hot day. 2 cups of hot green tea will leave you feeling cooler than a glass full of ice water. Ice water only cools the stomach, and then the body expends energy to warm that water. Hot tea preserves energy, and the green tea cools the entire system. Mint tea, served hot, is so cooling it can actually lower your core body temperature. Although we feel this is too extreme of a cooling action and should not be used on its own with regularity. Some examples for understanding up and down. Say we have a patient with constipation. We're going to choose foods with a downward movement. If I have a pregnant woman with a threatened miscarriage, I'm going to choose foods that bring energy upward. For gastroesophageal reflux disease, we want downward. Reflux, heartburn is stomach energy going upward. Ginger can be very helpful for this as it causes stomach energy to descend. By the way, mint would be counterproductive to reflux. It tends to make it worse. And then there's the inward and outward movement. This can be thought of as addition or subtraction. Say a patient has a problem due to weakness. We need to strengthen the person's energy or organ function. So we are adding to the person. We want to select a substance that moves inward to add energy to the body. Say the problem is due to some sort of pathogenic factor. Then we want substances that move outward as if we are taking something away from the body. One example of outward can be foods that make the pores open and cause sweating, which can release a superficial pathogen, for example. And then all of these strategies get tied together. So back to the constipation example. Is the pattern due to heat or to cold? If it's due to heat, we would select downward moving foods with a cooling nature. If it were due to cold, we would still select downward foods, but instead with a warming nature. And then the location gets factored in as well. So in this example, we would choose foods that have an affinity for the colon. So for you guys, temperature is one of the most important concepts to factor in. You can think of cold as less function and warm as optimal function. Chinese medicine describes the stomach as a soup cauldron. To maintain optimal digestion, one needs to maintain a perfect simmer in their soup cauldron. Consider when you are simmering a soup on the stove and you add new ingredients, raw, especially cold from the fridge, your soup loses its simmer and it takes time and energy to reheat back to that perfect simmer. The same consideration is made for our digestive system. Cold and raw food and drink compromise this simmer, which is our digestion. On the stove, the cooking flame works to restore temperature. In our body, our organs work to provide this fire. By eating warm foods, we have begun this process outside of our body, making it easier for our system to do the rest of the job. And the pace at which you are eating and what you are doing while you eat are very important. As I've already mentioned, when you're working your thoughts and emotions, you're working your organs. Light conversation is great, but sitting at your desk writing emails while eating can take vital energy away from the digestive process. Eating on the run is another example. I see a lot of nurses who have to do this because they are not given proper break time. And for many, this is just a habit independent of work demands. This is so important. Years ago, Dr. Akhil Palanasamy and I together gave a talk on the digestive system. He represented the Ayurvedic medicine point of view, and we basically were saying the same thing but in different words. And here's how he articulated this concept. He said, you can take the foods that were most ideal for your body and eat them while driving and talking on the phone, or you can take a meal that was not so ideal, but sit peacefully and eat it mindfully. The second one might actually be better for you. Of course, there are always exceptions. The point I want to emphasize is just how important this really is. By the way, over the years, I've had many patients with reflux, and they've already removed the common trigger foods, but still have symptoms. If I can get them to change this one habit of how they eat, the reflux will often go away. And another key aspect of Chinese dietetics is to consider the flavor of foods. These are generally divided into 5 main categories: salty, sweet, sour, bitter, spicy. The American diet tends to overconsume sweet and underconsume bitter. Bitter tends to have a downward quality and tends to promote digestion. Think about cultures that use an aperitif. These are bitter alcoholic drinks that are taken in small quantity before a meal. Or digestifs, which are the same concept but taken after a meal. These contain an appropriate level of bitter flavor. An example of too much can be coffee. Coffee is already bitter, and if it's not carefully prepared, it can be over-extracted, which makes it even more bitter. It's very common to hear people using coffee to induce their daily bowel movements. So a balanced diet in Chinese medicine includes each of the 5 flavors. Proportions may vary seasonally. For example, in the fall and winter, we suggest more warming foods with an inward action to nourish us through the colder months. In the summer, we might select more neutral or even cooling foods. Now keep in mind the affinity foods have for body areas. We never cool the digestive system unless there's some sort of pathogenic heat disease pattern at play. We want to just cool the body, like in my hot green tea example. The warmth prevents the injury to the spleen and stomach, but the action of the green tea will release excess heat from the body. Okay, so just some final words of advice. eat mostly warm foods, minimize ice, eat slowly and chew well, don't eat too much spicy food, don't eat while upset, pace yourself through meals, get plenty of rest, avoid fake, heavily processed foods, try to eat at regular times, and the body responds well to regularity. It loves rhythm, and it will learn when to be hungry and when to poop. That's all I have for you guys. I hope it was useful, and you're welcome to be in touch with our clinics to ask questions about our services and to make appointments with our practitioners. Thanks so much for joining me today.